Hey, welcome everyone to Acker's first ever Viva Italia, a week-long celebration of the great wines of Italy. We are pleased to be back here. We have a fantastic auction coming up Wednesday and Thursday, including 5 direct domain consignments from some of Italy's finest superstars: Quintarelli, Ceretto, Giacosa, Ornellaia, and Antinori. And my name is John Capon. I'm the chairman and owner of Acker Wines. I am joined by our own wine superstar, Lily Mirabel Friedman, who is my co-host in these events. How are you, Lily?
Doing well, John. Nice to be back.
Great to have you here. Great to be here. And now it is great to introduce and welcome our guest this evening, born in Caracas, Venezuela, to a family engrossed in the wine world. This gentleman's passion for wine began at the earliest age as he was writing articles about Bordeaux and Burgundy in high school for French class. And after forays into jazz music and investment banking, his passion for Italian wine could not be quenched, and he went on to become a professional wine writer. And he has gone on to since found Vinous Media, one of the most important and influential wine what would you call it? An organization, Antonio, or a
whatever you want.
Okay, conglomerate. It's a conglomerate now. It's growing.
That's your word.
Ladies and gentlemen, Antonio Galloni. Welcome, Antonio. Thank you for joining us.
John, I don't know if I can live up to that introduction, but I'll tell you, it's really fun to not have to host this and to be the person being asked questions instead of stressing out about getting through all the talking points and stuff. So I'm thrilled to be able to have a glass of wine and chill out and let you guys do the work.
Well, we are ecstatic to have you here. I mean, it's just amazing what you're doing at Vinous. Congratulations on all you're doing and continue to do. One of the most innovative and exciting companies in wine today. And so where are you coming from now? Are you traveling around yet? Where are you? What are you doing?
I'm still in my house in New York, but I'm ready to start traveling, imminently now, vaccinated, ×2 and ready to go. I think obviously it's been a really challenging period, and going to go visit some family and relatives that I haven't seen in a while first. That's number one priority, of course, but by next month, I'll be on the tasting circuit again. So that's great.
You have plans to go to Europe this summer at all?
Absolutely. At least once, maybe twice. A lot of work, a lot of trips that have been pushed back, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be home the second half of the year, but yeah, absolutely, we'll be in Europe a lot, and I think in a lot of places a lot. It's good.
And I assume that pretty much the bottles, even though you couldn't make their way to you couldn't make your way to the bottles have been making their way to you this year. A lot of shipments coming in, inbounds coming.
A lot of shipments. There's, fortunately, this is a nice house in size, and so there's whole rooms of boxes, and I've been able to taste everything that I always would taste. And there's one real benefit. I mean, I wouldn't want to do this every year, John. It's an enormous amount of work, the garbage and all that other stuff, but it is really fun to be able to taste wines over a day or 2 days. Or right now I've got my whole house here full of 2020 Bordeaux barrel samples. You can taste the wines the day they arrive. And it's really quite amazing. Just to give you an example, if you get lucky, they will prepare a sample on Monday in Bordeaux, and then Wednesday it's in your house. That's just sick. You can do that today with logistics. And then you can follow those wines for hours, days, which you can't do when you're in Bordeaux. You're on the pressure of tasting on primeur, chateau. And one of the things that's nice here is being able to follow the wines over a couple of days. I did my entire Piedmont article in the fall with all wines shipped from Italy, and it's the same deal. You can follow the wines over hours or a couple of days, and for big tannic young wines like that, that's really quite a benefit, actually. So the tasting part of it's been fine. I think I spent more time with each wine than I would have when I'm on the road, because it's hard because you don't have the context. You're not talking to somebody. You can't ask them questions except for over Zoom like this, but you can spend more time with each wine. And, it's really nice. I mean, I don't know what it was in December or January here. I had my whole kitchen full of all the Barolos all at once. So whatever you want, Rinaldi, Mascarello, Capellano, Paterno, you go back, taste them again. you know, sometimes I had second bottles, and I would open the second bottle like 2 weeks later to see how I was, if my feelings of wines had changed over time. So there's just some real advantages to tasting at home for a year, but it's not ideal for long term. So you just make the best of the opportunity that's in front of you at the time. You know, I think we had an incredible year last year. We published 28,000 reviews, the most we've ever published. And I think that was without travel, you can really focus on tasting wine. So it does have its benefits, but again, it's not something not a habit I want to get into. So let's hope this really is a once in 100-year event.
Yes, yes. Hopefully not another one in our lifetime. I think we're on the way back here, and everybody's looking forward to getting together. And Lily, why don't you set the framework for the group here while we before we get into the meat here?
Certainly. So I'll just ask that if our attendees have any questions this evening, they just submit them through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen, the 2 little conversation bubbles, and we'll address those questions as they come up. And make sure we get all of your questions for Antonio or John about the wines, about their lives in this evening. Back to you, John.
Thank you very much, Lily. So Antonio, let's talk a little bit about your childhood. Certainly an unusual path to the world of fine and rare wine. So you grew up in Venezuela. When were you first exposed to wine?
I was really lucky, John, because I was exposed from all sides of my family, but not necessarily to these sorts of wines that I taste, write about, that are up on my piano, or that you guys sell. I mean, very different world. But my father comes from a very poor Sicilian family, and there, when we go visit the relatives, my grandfather, who was like lean and like muscular and sinewy from working in the fields because he was a farm worker, he would drink a glass of white wine for lunch every day with half a peach in it. And these were wines that were bought at farms. So they would come back with these jugs of wine, like people would go get water filled up. They would come back with wine also, because at the time, and you will have heard this story, I'm sure, from people like Guillaume d'Angerville, bottled wines were not to be trusted at a certain point in history. People had a cultural distrust of bottled wines. And so if you wanted a high quality product, you'd actually take your jug to a farmer that you knew and you'd buy the bulk wine. Wow. And my grandfather would always have this wine at lunch or dinner, and that was the beginning of my understanding that wine was a food, you know, like something that accompanied the meal. I mean, today these wines have become, you know, these objects of desire, but the origins of wine are really as a food, as something that accompanies a meal, lunch, dinner, always a glass of wine. And so I got that from him, this idea that wine was a constant at the dinner table. My other side of the family, my mom's side of the family, was also Sicilian in origin, but my other grandfather had come to the States early, had an education, had a corporate career at some big companies. He was an expat in different parts of the world. And so he had a chance to taste Burgundy and Rhone wines. And he talked about things like, I think he had La Tâche once in his life, and he talked about it like this religious experience. And so I heard what that was when I was a teenager. I mean, I had no idea how grand it was, but my American grandfather, he would open Cote Tea on for Sunday lunch, or like a Trappe Chambertin, I remember. Those wines weren't necessarily that, they weren't prized back then, when we were kids. They weren't like cheap, but they were affordable for a middle class person to have, which today is, sadly not the case. But you could have those wines on Sunday lunch and not think about what you paid for them or what they were worth. They were just something that you had. So those are the kinds of wines that I got to, exposed to from that side of the family. And then, my first language is Spanish. And when I was in high school, I was a very rebellious kid. I got suspended from school all the time. I was always in trouble, getting into fights, and it was a horribly behaved person. And all I wanted to do was play music. And so for my language elective, I wanted to take Spanish because I thought, well, I'll just cruise through Spanish because it's my native tongue. But my mom said, no way, you're taking French. And I hated it. Now, it's like, oh my God, Mom, I love you. It's so essential. Champagne, Burgundy, Bordeaux, all these places that I go to. But in high school, she made me take 4 years of French. And my parents had a friend who ran a bistro type restaurant. And I always like, you know, so like, this is one of the wines, you know, this wine, it has a lot of text on here, right? And I wanted to understand what every word meant. And so I became fascinated with places, history, labels. So my mom would ask this very kind woman to save the labels of the wines that she had opened in the restaurant. And that's where I wrote those papers that you referenced in your very nice introduction. So for me, it was a very early interest in kind of like the historical aspect of wine. The fact that, you know, like, this is a complicated label. It doesn't tell you the grape type. It tells you a lot of things, but it doesn't tell you the grape. And in America, we're used to Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and Syrah and Cabernet Sauvignon. So I became interested in the labels and the places and the stories that they told. And that's how I wrote those papers. And my parents saw that I had an interest in wine, so they gave me these books to read when I was a teenager, you know, Lexus de Sheen and Johnson and Victor Kazan, and these classic books that, you know, a lot of people don't even remember anymore. And then they had a wine shop when I was in high school. So I got into like, you know, stocking the shelves and looking at the labels and getting into it that way. And then my parents would bring home these bottles of wine for dinner that, you know, you really couldn't afford to do anymore because, I mean, who's gonna, you know, how much Giacosa do you get, or Gaia, or any of those kinds of wines? I mean, you might get, as a nice store, you might get, you know, a case or two or three, but, you know, to take a bottle and bring it home, I mean, number one, the cost of that wine is high. You also don't have it to sell, and you didn't start off with that much to sell. So today, that'd be really hard to do it. You know, my mom and dad, they'd come home with, you know, Solaya or Chaparello or Felsinacchianti Rancia or Ceretto. You know, my parents both loved to cook, and so I was just exposed to it from a really early age. So I was very lucky to grow up with these wines sort of like around all the time. And, you know, it was a great education, but sadly, I think it's a very difficult education for someone to have today because wines have become so expensive. And so for a young person, you're either working as a som in a restaurant or maybe, you know, at a company like yours, and you get exposure that way. But it's really hard to like just pop these wines open on a Monday night because they've all become so cultish. So I was lucky to get started when that wasn't the case, especially for Italian wines.
Right. Well, back then, I mean, you could have whatever you want, whenever you wanted, and it was just open season on everything. And people don't realize how demand, even 30 years ago, was really small, you know, for some of the world's best wines, and you could really literally just get whatever you wanted. And now you got to work for it. It's they're around. You either got to work for it or you got to pay for it. Those are the two ways to do it. And
so you have to decide also quickly, John, right? Like back in those days, you'd go into a store, you could buy something, take it home, decide that you liked it, and then go buy a case of it later. Like today, it's like, you know, you have the way the wine is sold all over the world is you've got to decide today if you want to buy your 6 bottles or 12 bottles or 3 bottles or whatever. You very rarely get a chance to taste it unless, I mean, we have a lot of readers like this, and I'm sure you have a lot of customers like this, people who travel for wine, who are really at the very pinnacle, who taste all sorts of stuff and have great palates. So those folks get a chance to taste things. But for most people, you know, you have to just sort of decide whether to buy something kind of on the spot. And it's no longer I can go and buy and taste a fantastic wine like a 96 month Ripasso from Mascarello, and then a month later it's still in the store and I can go buy it some more, and then 6 months later it's still there and I can go buy some more. Right. That's obviously history. So I really recognize that I was very lucky to have this exposure when, you know, before these wines became these objects of desire. It's hard to do today.
Yeah, no, it really was a golden age, even for me, you know, growing up in the industry 25 years ago. I mean, back then, you just, whatever you wanted, you could just try it. You get a few guys together, everybody would chip in, and it wasn't, you know, the major financial commitment it is today. But so after a little bit of wine in high school and growing up with the retail environment and helping out, you decided to go down the music route. So you went to school of music and got into investment banking. So what that's a lot of diverse areas that you went through. And then finally, what made you come back to wine after all that?
You know, it's funny. I had a very conflicted relationship with my dad, you know, when I was younger. So my parents really wanted me, especially my dad, really wanted me to take over the family business, and I wanted nothing to do with it, you know. So I went to music school, which was great, and then I was an out of work musician, and so I started, you know, having these little sort of temping jobs in Boston, and that became my corporate job. And I was never an investment banker. That's written on the internet all over the place, but it's not really true. But I did sell hedge funds and mutual funds and other things, but never. So I never had the bank account of an investment banker. But anyway, I did work in the financial world for a number of years. But you know, that was another great experience because, you know, I started doing that in the late '90s, and it was the middle of like the technology boom, and I was working at a really fast-growing Boston company that kept promoting people from within. They had this very strong culture of mentorship and development. And I speak 4 languages, which is an incredible gift. And they were like, one guy sat me down and said, "Look, I know you think you're going to be a musician, but here's the reality. You know, it's a hard life, and you have this language ability, and we need people to work overseas, and we'd like to put you through, you know, sponsor you through our training program." And I was like, "Well, you know, why not?" It's, you know, and I did it, and I loved it. I loved the camaraderie of a group of people. I loved it was a friendly, competitive environment. And this was in 1998. And as soon as I got into this training program, long-term capital happened. And at the time, that seemed like a massive financial crisis, but it was like nothing compared to the things we've been through since then. But I was basically on the phone for like 10, 12 hours a day talking to people about bond deals and things. It was just an incredible education. 3 years later, I was working as an expat in Italy. You know, this company, you know, they took a chance on me, and I went from like being an out-of-work musician waiting tables to working in a call center to having a house in Milan, like 10 minutes away from the castle in the most beautiful residential area in Milan. It's a ridiculous job. And my job in Italy was to explain financial markets to our company's customers all over Italy. So I was living on an expense account, single, and I was going to all these places for work. Venice, Rome, Florence, you know, the Amalfi Coast, all over the countryside of Veneto, which, you know, the northern belt, the industrial northern belt is very wealthy. Italy, Torino, Genova, Verona, Vicenza, that whole area. I had all my customers there, and I was always taking people out for lunch or for dinner. And that's when I started drinking really good wine every single day. You know, not necessarily like these sorts of epic bottles, but really good wine. And they were inexpensive, obviously, so you could have a Barolo every night if you wanted, or whatever. It didn't matter, you know. And that was in Italy before restaurants used to market. You know, I'm sure you remember, John, because we're sort of the same age, but there was a time when restaurants in Europe were not necessarily concerned. I mean, it's still the case in France and Italy, but it's less than it used to be, where wines on lists used to be kind of like retail plus a little something, but not what we're used to here in the States, 2, 3, 4, 5x. That never existed. It's starting a little bit now, but you know, you could drink these wines for retail plus a little something.
Right, and they never marked them. They never moved the price either. It just stayed there forever.
They would never move the price if something, if, you know, 5 or 10 years had passed. Yeah. So that was another great education into wine, was just, you know, having, you know, being on the road, living this very nice kind of like expense account life. We weren't drinking like Monfortino. Well, Monfortino was that expensive then. But we weren't drinking necessarily those kinds of wines, but drinking really good wine every night. And so then I started writing about, I wanted to keep track of the wines I was having, so I started taking notes on them. And then that's how writing started. It's just kind of a way to, it was a way of keeping track of what I had, you know. So.
Well, I'm glad. I'm surprised actually that you're not like 300 pounds with all those lunches and dinners in Italy for years, but you managed to stay in shape.
But I learned something really important in Italy about food, Tom, which is that like the people in my office, they would always go out for lunch and sit down in a proper restaurant, and the companies all have these kind of meal plans where they would give, not for me because I was an expat, but for the people who worked in these companies, they would all have like a meal allowance. I think it was 10 euros a person that you would get like this coupon for. And the restaurants would all have something available at that price. So but what happened is at lunch, everybody would leave their desks and they would go and sit down at a proper restaurant and have a plate of pasta or a pizza or a salad for like 45 minutes or an hour, and then go back to work. And you would never see anybody eating the sandwich at their desk or any of the kind of horrible kind of behaviors that we're used to in this country. And when you eat a healthy meal, then what you don't have is the temptation for snacking. And you know what really kills you is the between meal things. So people would have a proper lunch, and then you never saw anybody eating any snacks, and then obviously proper dinner. But I think when you eat healthy food, it is more nourishing to your body, to your system, and therefore you don't get these cravings for things that are really what destroy you. So even with all that traveling, I actually lost weight in Italy because I was eating healthier and eating better, even though the food was not lighter, not necessarily not rich, but it's just you eat the right amount at the right time.
Right.
So
interesting. That's a good piece of advice. Maybe I should try that out because I'm like doing that, like trying to do the small thing every couple of hours, or a little thing. Maybe I'll change it up and start having some pasta for lunch instead. We'll see if I can.
Well, you go for a walk afterwards. That you always.
Right. Speaking of cravings, Lily, why don't you take us in? Let's talk about some wine here. We got some great wines to get through. Tell us about the first wine, Lily.
I think Antonio should tell us about the first wine. I think he's had the most experience at Quintarelli than any of us on this chat today, perhaps. I will say someone in the chat did chime in and say that it's law in Italy that if you don't provide lunch, you must give employees a 2-hour lunch break to go home and get lunch.
Okay, so I was not aware of that, but obviously in an urban center like Milan, that's just not practical. So but that's the 2-hour deal. So yeah, that's how it worked. Everybody had a coupon and it worked. I mean, it seemed to work really well for everybody. So there's 2 Quintarelli wines, right? The first one is this.
We're going to start with the white and Quintarelli.
Bianco
Secco. Go right ahead, Antonio.
Well, this is like, a blend based on Garganega. Garganega is an indigenous variety of Veneto and Soave. Quintarelli, I was really lucky to taste with the old man a few times, and you go there, you always got a sense they weren't really happy to see you. It's funny, like today, it's like there's very few of these visits left in wine. Everything is a business. If you go to Bordeaux during Entrepreneur, there's these whole tents set up for people to check in, and it's a huge production. And there's not, obviously in Burgundy, the Rhone, and Piedmont, there's still a lot of these places obviously like this, but it's kind of very, very, it was back then. It is still today, but a little bit less so. But back then, when Beppe was alive, it was, you go there, you got the feeling they weren't really happy to see you. They were kind of grumpy, they're like, okay, we'll look at this wine. And I always wanted to taste the wine from like a freshly opened bottle. So that always seemed to annoy them because, like they would have, it's kind of cultural to leave bottles open for a couple of days because you wouldn't throw them out, that would be wasteful, so there's a lot of, that doesn't happen so much anymore, but sometimes it would be, wines open for days. So I'd ask very politely, can I taste these wines from a freshly opened bottle? And it was always like, oh, okay, whatever. And then you couldn't spit when you were tasting like that, but no spitting. So you can imagine, the Bianco is a nice, it's a nice floral, pretty wine, beautiful for crudo or something like that. When I taste this wine, I wish I was at Morea eating crudo, somewhere like that. But when you get to those Amarones and the Reciotos and the Alzero, which are like pretty high octane wines, and you're like, and they pour you this glass, and it's like, there's not a barrel to put it back in. It's not like Burgundy, so you got this glass, and it's like, I really love having this much Amarone, but I'm glad somebody else is driving me around because it could be a little dangerous. So that's what it was like tasting there with him, and he's one of those people that's like, they just don't make them like that anymore because you're talking about somebody with decades of winemaking tradition. And But so anyway, you taste the Bianco Secco. It's a sort of aromatic white built based on Garganega, and
is this a blend of grapes or just all Garganega? Same grape as Soave, pretty much, or?
It's based on Garganega, and then it's Trebbiano Toscano, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, and Saurin.
Wow. Yeah, very exotic, really complex, rich, nice, rich.
Yeah, so this wine always has this kind of light tropical, kind of very light tropical style, and it's very aromatic. And it's, as I said, it's just a really nice, delicious sort of floral, easygoing wine. Garganega is the grape of Soave. So, but you're there in the heart of, you know, what they call the Classico zone of Amarone. It's beautiful olive trees around there, and it's very close to Tommaso Bussola, the Quintarelli estate, which now has a modern winery, which is really, I think, very cool because you have the juxtaposition of the, you know, it's not like Frank Gehry or anything, but it's certainly modern, and you've got that in the contrast of these very traditional, you know, wines with the handwritten labels and stuff. But you know, this is really, you know, you're talking about artisan handmade wines, and I think that, you know, we all have the same computers and phones and so on and so forth. And I think that as the world becomes more globalized, there's just less, there's fewer and fewer things there's fewer and fewer of these experiences in wine, really handmade, family-owned, you know, handmade wines, family-owned wineries, handed down through generations with what you always get, which is in these wineries, not always, but you often get with these wineries, the bumps of generational transition. These are very human wines. It's not corporate winemaking. There's no enologists from the University of Bordeaux or a consultant coming in to do the blends. And so you have these periods maybe of ups and downs, just like all of us in life. You have life. You've got your better years, your not so good years. You have your years that are challenging personally, your years where you're flourishing, whatever. In the course of life, it's just the arc of humanity for anybody. And these wines, they reflect that. And I think that's very beautiful.
That's a great way to put it. You really can taste the soul in this wine. And this is a treat for me. I didn't even know Quintarelli made a white wine. I don't think you ever even see this. I mean, it's not a big production for sure. These are really handcrafted kind of wines. And so this is fun. I think the whites of Italy in general, I think a lot of people do not understand how great Italian white wines are, because everybody thinks, oh, it's the Santa Margherita Pinot Grigio, it's this big commercial, and Pinot Grigio became so popular. Well, because actually Pinot Grigios can be great. That's why it became popular, but then it got so commercialized, it kind of took the whole Italian white category with it to like be considered, oh, you know, it's like a commercial wine, it's not a serious wine. But I think there's a whole world of serious Italian whites to be discovered.
Yeah, you go in the south of Italy, where you've got wine history that goes back millennia. You've got really interesting whites. In the north, there's Veneto, of course, but I think even more exciting as regions are places like Friuli and Alto Adige, which is, you know, I mean, that's just one of the pearls of the world. You've got world-class skiing and incredible food culture and beautiful wines, including whites that are really crisp and precise and beautiful. And yeah, and Italy for white wines is there's a lot to discover there too, for sure. And obviously those are really great wines for the table because they're less imposing, and you want to sit down with a Premier Cru Burgundy. I mean, that's like a wine that's, you know, like it really demands your full attention, and that's beautiful too. But a wine like this, you and a couple of friends would polish off a few bottles without even thinking about it. I think that there's a certain joy to that.
Especially you get a Quintarelli quality at you know, $50 a bottle is a nice thing too, because the reds obviously get more expensive. What are some of the other producers in the Veneto that you like that might not be as expensive as Quintarelli, that you kind of, you know, some producers that you really enjoy, think are making some excellent wines?
I think you look at something like Inama. They're a you know, very classic producer of Soave. Piero Pan, I think, you know, they make beautiful wines, and they have several different categories. It's sort of like the steel-aged version, which is the Classico, which is just like a beautiful everyday wine or restaurant wine that's not going to kill you, right? And then And then you go to the things that they do in oak that are a little bit more sort of serious and structured. Genie. It's one of the things about Soave. There's a question here about aging that. So the Bianco Secco is kind of its own little thing because it's a blend, but Soave actually ages beautifully. It's something that most people don't know because these wines are basically they're the kind of wine you drink with Crudo or looking at Lake Garda or something. Nobody's thinking about aging Soave, but these wines, I'm not going to say it's like a world-class Riesling or something that's like a 40-year wine, but you can surely go 10 or 15 years with really nice Soaves, and they age beautifully. It's not just that they age, because I think a lot of times people ask, they'll say like, what's the perfect time to taste this wine, or what's the drinking window? And I think that one of the reasons why you age a wine is not for how long it lasts, but the idea that wine improves over time, not just that it can hang on. And because lots of wines can hang on, but very few can have a sort of evolution. And I think Soave is one of the Italian whites that will give you a good 10, 12 years, easy, sometimes more, a really beautiful evolution in the bottle. And they age beautifully. So those are the wines, those are the ones that I would Pure Genie, those are two really good ones.
Genie, yeah, absolutely. Genie and Pure Pen, that's good. And that's for the white side. They don't, but what about the reds too? I mean, we'll get to the reds later. Maybe we can cover that later because we have the whites now. But this is a delicious white. That was one of the questions from the crowd, Lily, about the ageability, which Antonio just addressed. What about the other? There was another question about
we'll get to when we get to the Ricciotto, I think makes more sense there.
All right. So let's head north to back to Milan and to Piedmont.
Yeah.
Right. We have some Ceretto. We got Barbaresco and Barolo, of course, the two iconic regions from Piedmont. And so you were living in Milan. It was kind of your first home away from home in Italy. And how long did you live in Italy?
I lived in Italy for 3 years, and as an expat. And on the weekends, I would go to Piedmont because it was a 2-hour drive, more or less. And you wake up on a Saturday, and you can't do this anymore either, John. But you could wake up on a Saturday in November and say, "Oh, let's go have truffles for lunch," And you would go to Barbaresco. But like today, you got to reserve that restaurant like a month in advance. But back then, it's crazy. You could just literally decide on a Saturday, "Oh, what are we going to do today? Let's go eat truffles." Okay. But Piedmont is, very close to Milan, and that's where I would spend a lot of weekends. And these small family-run estates are open Saturdays, even Sundays, and it was just a great education. And that's what I would do when I had a weekend off, or a weekend that I wasn't traveling or doing something, is I would go to visit these wineries. And Ceretto was one of the first ones that I visited because my parents had sold these wines, and I knew about them, obviously, and the brothers had really, along with Vietti and a few others, were really among the families that were the early exporters to the United States. So, better known than a lot of other estates. I just fell in love with the accessibility of these wines and the accessibility of the producers that, you could taste with the actual winemaker, which is even now hard because all these places now are forced to have a more structured kind of, hospitality kind of program. But back then, you'd spend hours with these producers tasting wines from the barrel and all sorts of stuff. And, back then, you could buy whatever you wanted. They'd be happy to take your money as much as you wanted. Taste there was no limit of anything. It's just absolutely insane because it wasn't that long ago.
Cash was still king. You just walk up. And
there was that too, but the wine was available. If you had cash, you could, that was before there was a lot of record keeping things. But sure, if you had cash, that helped. But even not, people were very happy.
You can still get an invoice or be billed. Right, you can still get what you want.
Very happy to sell you wine, and in fact, they weren't even happy to sell you wine. I mean, I started writing about wine pretty early, so I never accepted bottles from people, but they used to give you a bottle as a thank you for visiting. And I've got friends who are like, Lily's laughing, this is a true story. I got a friend who's about 15 years older than I am, so not that old, because I still think of myself as young. But anyway, he tells stories about going to Conterno and being given Magnum of Monfertino as a thank you for the visit.
Wow. Nice.
It's just like, wow.
I don't think Roberto does that anymore.
Yeah, but I mean, that was the culture. The culture was, thank you for coming to see us. Thank you for taking.
Yeah, people wouldn't really go if you were, unless you were local. Like people, it was not like a destination. It's a farming kind of area and lifestyle.
Yeah, so they were happy to. They're like, wow, you're from the U.S. and you came to see us. Thank you for your time. And they were very traditional back then. They in a lot of ways they still are. No mixing of groups. That's a very classic Piedmontese sign of respect, which is, we don't mix people from different groups. You'll see that that's very rare in Italy, that you are put in with somebody else. If somebody agrees to see you, you're usually if you're with a group, but it's very rare that you're mixed in with other visitors. Happens sometimes, but it's pretty unusual. So this is all about these are what I call sort of, there's no real word. The word for vigneron in Italian doesn't quite work as well, but they're very much artisan country values, that are very pure, I think. And Piedmont is still like that in a lot of ways. So Ceretto is, obviously one of those leading families. I should point out for anybody who may not know that this is the Azzilli, but this is the wine that used to be called Bricco Azzilli. So it's the top Barbaresco. And they changed the name. So now it's just called Azzilli. But if you're wondering why I haven't seen that label before or whatever, that's the wine they used to call Bricco Azzilli.
Yes, talk to us about Azzilli. I mean, that's one of the really important vineyards in Barbaresco. And 2016, also one of the great vintages, right? And the Ceretto family is kind of, this wine's delicious, by the way. And it's kind of a forgotten family, in the world of fine wine, but it's one of the biggest families in all of Piedmont. It's a mega family, right? And it's like, I don't think people really know the level of the family. I mean, they own the 3-star restaurant in the Piazza Duomo, and they're just a super important family in the region. And I think their wines are really kind of, they've gone through different phases, and now they're making delicious wines again, and have been for a while, right?
Yeah, I think that's why there's, I wouldn't quite say that they're forgotten, but I think producers come in and out of style a little bit. And, the Cerettos were very instrumental in promoting Italian wines in the United States. The first vintage for this wine, I think, is 1974. So they were very early buyers of land. This is one of the big changes in Piedmont of the last 40 or 50 years, is the transition from bottlers to from large negociant type companies to estate bottlers and family and owning vineyards. So they were among the early people to do that. But then, in the 80s and 90s, they started to make more modern wines. There's an 07 here, and when you taste that wine, you can definitely taste more influence of oak and kind of the style that was prevalent at that time. So I think what happened with this family is, they were an early leader. Then in the 80s and 90s, too, they started to make more modern wines. But at the same time, that was when we saw this explosion of estates that were making really exciting wines. Sandrone, Lotares, Vino, Borezio, that whole Clerico, all those people. And, I wouldn't say that they're forgotten, but, back in the 60s, 70s, maybe not 60s, but 70s, 80s, they were one of a few. Now they're one of many, because there's a lot of really great people making wine. So in the 80s, starting, 80s, 90s period, wine started to get more modern, more oaky.
Yeah.
And like everything, it sort of gets pushed to a certain kind of breaking point, because winemakers are always, the talented ones are always trying to see like where they can take things, and then it comes back, And so in the 16 Barbaresco, you're tasting a wine with, very neutral oak influence. This is a great vintage, by the way, 16, but very neutral oak influence.
Wine is delicious. The 16 is great.
Yeah, Azzilli is a vineyard that's very sandy, so you get these aromatics. That's the main signature of Azzilli, is the perfume. So whether it's the Ceretto Azzilli or Produttore del Barbaresco, or whoever you want to pick, Bruno Giacosa, when it's the right vintage, the wines are really effusive in the aromatics, and that's the that's the signature of Azzilli. It's sort of like a Musigny style Piedmont wine, but with the tannins of Nebbiolo. So always this kind of palish color, which is the color of Nebbiolo. They say you're supposed to be able to see your thumbnail through the glass, right? That's the color of Nebbiolo. So translucent red, reddish color, you know, like a cherry color, very aromatic, but with that tannic spine of Nebbiolo. And now they've pulled back into more neutral oak and also more, I'm not sure if it's biodynamic exactly, but you know, much more sustainable kind of farming, ambient yeasts and winemaking. And so today's Ceretto is very different from the Ceretto even of 2007.
Yeah, they are very different, the two wines, and I much prefer the 16. I mean, that's just a wine I could drink, you know, all night, so to speak. A 7, I think, still needs a little more time. With the oak, it's bigger, it's tighter, and you have to have, you know, it's a taste for that style of oakiness. Do you think there's a year where you kind of there's a transformation, or is it a gradual thing over the past decade, or how has the style evolved?
Well, I think these things are usually gradual because you don't. You know, if you overdo it, then it's very difficult to figure out what you've changed exactly. So I think you have a gradual transition. I mean, I've noticed it. I think it's the last 5 or 6 years for Ceretto that the wines have just gone into this direction of real purity. You know, 07 was a very warm, dry vintage, so the vintage starts out more intense, and then you put that oak on there. You have a wine that's, you know, I mean, like if we were tasting these wines blind, I think a lot of people might have a hard time even identifying that they're the same producer, you know, because the styles are very different. Obviously, one's Barolo, and Barolo is always a bigger, more structured wine with a little more alcohol, just generally speaking. But in the 16 Barbaresco, you have that translucence. You know, this is like if you were going to teach a class on what Nebbiolo is or what Barbaresco is, that Ceretto 16 is a textbook wine. It's got the midweight structure, the aromatics, that spine of tannin, that freshness, the energy. It's, you know, they say the velvet fist and the iron fist and the velvet glove, right? The ability to convey power without weight. So that's the 16. When you get to the 7, this is like a wine of its era. It's powerful, it's rich, it's dense, it's oaky. And I think it's hard to taste today because in general, the wines of the world have moved in the direction like this Ceretto just all over the world. Oak has come down, extractions have come down. People are working to make wines that are more restrained. It could be in Burgundy, it could be in Napa, it could be in Bordeaux, it could be in Piedmont. And so tasting a wine like 07 is kind of hard to taste with the palate of 2021 because we've gotten used to these more sort of, I don't want to use light because that's almost a pejorative, but we've gotten used to these more refined ones. And now when you taste a wine from, and that's like not even 10 years difference, right? But it just shows you how much things can change.
Yeah, big change.
Yeah.
I mean, it's exciting.
Yeah. I think Piedmont right now, I mean, there's a reason why these wines have become so coveted. And that's because people taste wines like that 16 and they're like, wow, I want to buy a case of that. You know, and that's a response. We see it with our readers too. It's pretty unusual. People will say, I mean, I've got friends who, you mentioned my event, the Festa, I mean, I've got friends who are major collectors of Burgundy and Bordeaux, then they come to one of our events and they taste, you know, Brulotto Mobiliero, and now they want cases of that. It's kind of a problem for the market. But when you have a lot of people who have this kind of reaction, you know, it can really change the dynamics of it. So the 7 is a wine of its era. You know, it's a wine of its time, and you know, it was more exciting to me back then than it is today because these wines have all made these major leaps into tasting the wine from another era with today's palate.
Yeah, that 16 is, like you said, it's just textbook. And to me, it's exciting because the Ceretto, their portfolio is so important. They have so many great vineyards. And so to me, it's exciting to see a family that's just, you know, that's rooted so deeply in the region, kind of rediscover what they're doing and make something this good. So, I mean, I think this is super exciting for me to see these wines. And that's why we kind of included, you know, them in the auction because they are such an important family. They're probably one of the largest landowners in Piedmont, right? And and they have some amazing vineyards. And
I think, you know, you look at a family like this, and you have they have the 3-star restaurant which you mentioned in Alba, which is not really my style personally, but it's important to have a restaurant like that in a region because it brings people.
It's not that many 3 stars in Italy, which is kind of a joke. That the fact that like the whole, I mean, there's so much great food in Italy, and they only have like 8 3-star restaurants. I mean,
I think the stars
service is it to forget about service?
I think Italy is one of those countries where the food has an inverse relationship to the stars. You want the 1-star places. That's more authentic, and the 3 stars. Okay, whatever. You got to go once to say you've gone, but it doesn't matter. The point is they've invested in it. They have it, and I like actually the downstairs of that place, which is more like a trattoria, and you can have like a really beautiful stew or house or whatever, and people watch Canavo, which is a beautiful area. But you know they've done all sorts of things like all of these things that nobody else has done. They've sponsored these artists, and you know, the Vico Rocca winery. That's where they have that famous cube, and they have the chapel in La Morra that's painted, and you know, it's just I mean, there's nobody else who, you know, I mean, they've always had this very international sort of vision, and you know, I think that has its pros and its cons, right? Sometimes you get a wine like the Vico Rocca that maybe you think, okay, this might have been like a little bit overdone. The wines today are really beautiful, but I think, you know, every region has those families that are, you know, in Burgundy, it's the Demontis, and it's the Villeneuves, and it's, you know, the Gagés, and those families, the Dangerville, those families that are sort of like the pillars of a local, you know, culture, society, and so that's, you know, in Piedmont, you know, Ceretto is one of those sorts of families with others, of course, but it's one of those, you know, kind of families that is a kind of institutional pillar for the contributions to the culture, which, you know, there's not, I mean, if you just look around and say, you know, how many families like that are there, there's plenty that make the contribution with wine that are phenomenal. But those other sort of more holistic investments, there's just not a ton of those. But, so interesting for sure.
Yeah, amazing wine, and I'm gonna, I think, come back to the red of Quintarelli for the closer for the evening, so to speak. And Lily, we had a question about this from the crowd.
We can talk a little. I'd like Antonio to talk a little bit about the process that goes into making Amarone and Recioto. So the question particularly called out the Ripasso technique, which is part of making Amarone. So perhaps Antonio, for everyone's edification, can describe how Amarone gets made and the kind of meticulous nature of making Amarone.
And what's the difference? Sorry to cut you off, but what the difference between like Recioto versus Amarone, and what the difference is between those two as well?
Yeah, so you start off with the fact that this is a very ancient technique, and so I think this question is really about I think this question is really about the Ripasso technique for Valpolicella. So I'm not really sure, but I'm going to answer. I'm going to give you the whole landscape of how these wines are made. We'll start with a core wine, which is Amarone. So that wine is made from grapes that are picked, and then they're dried. So if you go air dried for several months. So if you go to Veneto in the fall, you would see these big rooms with different levels of technology, but basically the drying of grapes. And this is called appassimento, and that's used to obviously to concentrate the flavors and sugars, believed to be a very ancient technique when it was very, very difficult to get ripeness. So it's like
they're basically raisinade, right? They're turning into raisins.
Exactly. Yeah, and then typically the the wines can only be fermented until January of the next year. So if you figure a normal harvest is like, I don't know, mid-September-ish, late September-ish, maybe October, you're talking about 2 months, 3 months maybe, drying, concentrating.
Okay.
In these ventilated rooms. Okay, and then those raisinated grapes make Amarone. Okay, the Ripasso technique is when you take okay, so that's Amarone. So if we have the big Quintarelli bottle, that's the Amarone.
Right.
Then sometimes what people do is they will take the skins from the Amarone, and they will take their Valpolicella, which is the fresh, the sort of more straightforward, fresh grape red wine of the Veneto, so a much simpler wine. They'll take that and they'll re-ferment it over the skins of the Amarone, and that becomes a Ripasso Valpolicella. So a lot of houses, especially the bigger ones, they'll have like a range of wines. And we'll have a Valpolicella, which is that wine made from freshly crushed grapes, so just like a straight red wine, like any other red wine.
Right.
Then they'll have the Valpolicella Ripasso, which is a more concentrated Valpolicella because you started off with fresh grapes and then you did a secondary fermentation on the skins of your Amarone. So that's your mid-level sort of Valpolicella. Then you have your Amarone, which is your big red wine, and then Recioto is that with more residual sugar. And so you get these wines that are just, much richer. Let me see what it says. I don't know if it says it's alcohol 15.5. It doesn't say what the sugars, but you can obviously feel the
65 grams per liter.
Yeah. So
not inconsiderate.
It's interesting as these wines age, though. I remember one of the best wines I ever had. We had together at your Festa event, and it wasn't a Barolo, it was a Quintarelli. I brought the 71 Reserva, which was like lights out, but they actually start to get drier with age, and they they dry a little bit. They have that sweetness and richness, but it's that wealth of fruit that can carry these wines for decades, right? What's the oldest Amarone you ever had, and was it still good?
Well, I mean, it might have been older than that in years, but it was a 30 or 40 year kind of wine. The wines do age really well. There's a challenge that these wines have, which is that Amarone is not an easy wine to pair. I mean, it's like, gee, how many bottles of Amarone did you drink last year?
Right. It's really like a dessert style almost. That's why you almost need that 30 or 40 years. Yeah. Right. So
there's not too many of those that you can have in a year, and so the sales of those wines have struggled, for quite a while now, and so there's a move to make Amarone with a little bit more of a restrained style, so not so much drying and not so heavy. I mean, I think probably the most kind of extremely rich wines, although they're very different in style, would be something like Dalforno, and then the old man's Amarones. The Quintarelli wines today are a little bit more. You get the impression that they're a little bit more laid back. The old Amarones that Pepe made and Alzero, which is a Cabernet Franc heavy blend, those just opulent, full throttle wines, and those are just insanely beautiful. They do age forever. So these wines have obviously a lot of sugar. The fermentations take a long time, and then Recioto you have a wine with more residual sugar that's left over, and so that gives you that extra viscosity. And that the market for sweet wines, whether it's Sauterne or Recioto, is really also difficult because how many times a year can you open one of these wines? And holidays and things like that. But it's certainly not like that Bianco Secco. You go out to dinner with a few friends, you could polish up a few bottles. You try to drink a few bottles of Amarone, and it's a proposition. So I think that it's a challenge for these areas to find relevancy sometimes for the wines. And these sweet wines from Veneto, they're outrageously great. And the Recioto, of Valpolicella is a red wine, and this is named after the enologist Roberto, who passed away a few ago. I think about 7 years ago now.
Right,
And,
yeah.
Yeah, but there's beautiful white wines too. You know, like those Maculan wines. They're just insanely beautiful. The Veneto is a marvelous region to explore. I mean, you know, everybody's always focused on Piedmont and Tuscany, but you know, Veneto has Verona and the opera and that beautiful town and Vicenza and Palladian architecture and all sorts, and Lake Garda and, you know, fantastic crudo and all these beautiful villas that you can go stay in. And it's perfect biking because it's hilly if you want it to be and flat if you want it to be. And it's one of those regions that people don't go and explore as much as everybody wants to go and have, you know, pasta in Tuscany, which is nothing wrong with that stuff. That's one of the things I learned when I was in Italy, was just how beautiful some of these other regions are. And that northern industrial belt there. I had a lot of clients, you know, near these areas. And, you know, there's, for people who love cycling, there's several like very high, like world-class producers of like racing bikes in that area. There's all sorts of industrial activity, you know, with the wine, you know, like the lakes. I mean, it's just a spectacular area. So you can really fall in love. As I think wine is not just the wine, it's kind of the whole context. In Piedmont, you want to have truffles and, you know, of course, but in Veneto, there's all these regions have something particular, but the Veneto is one of those regions that people don't go see that much. Unless people go to Verona, they want to see, you know, Romeo and Juliet. Maybe go to the opera and do some shopping, but that's great. But, you know, beyond that, there's fabulous food and wine. And, you know, those two wines from Quintarelli are two examples. I think Ceretto is, you know, like, I mean, I can already feel a buzz, and I just had like a little bit of but those are wines that can't be made anywhere else. And again, right. Talking about, you know, like when I would go and visit there, like they almost like they wouldn't even want to open a bottle for you. You know, it's like because it's such a prized, rare thing, and they're expensive. You know, I mean, it was expensive.
Yeah, this half bottle's $175. That's not cheap. That's Echem money right there for.
It's based on just the real estate of the cellar itself. That's part of why it's so expensive.
Yeah, you know, there's nothing like the chocolate. I mean, you know, I mean, I think it's beautiful with like
but I think there's nothing like Italy, and you hit it on the head. I was just going to say it. The great thing about Italy is that everything, what is there, 1,000 indigenous grape varietals in Italy, and they're nowhere else, and nobody else can make it, and only Italy, and they have so many unique wines, and there's so many great expressions. As great as Piedmont and Tuscany are, there's still these so many great expressions beyond that. And it's like you said, I think you said it in the introduction you did, in the catalog, there's just so much to discover every day. You could be drinking something new and something different. And that's what makes Italy so special. I mean, I often find myself drinking Italian wines at home, and I still think there's tremendous value too for like some of the great wines. You know, it's not like every great wine is $500 or $1,000 a bottle, like in Bordeaux or Burgundy. You know, there's real value to be discovered.
And I think the reason Italian wines are so popular is because, you know, they you know, there was a time when really good food was considered very technically driven, rich, sauce heavy. And as people get older, your doctor says you gotta eat a more Mediterranean diet, get rid of the butter, have olive oil, more vegetables, you know, and that is a classic sort of Italian kind of diet. And I think that these wines work so well because they fit the kind of way that we want to eat today, which is maybe not so rich, but maybe more ingredient driven, you know, sort of, I don't mean simple in a bad way, but more ingredient driven, pure kinds of foods. And that's why you could have a glass of Italian wine every day and you would never get bored because you have all of these different areas to go and explore. And, you know, these wines date back to like Roman times. I mean, there's a real history. You know, it may not be the Dukes of Burgundy or the Bordeaux classification or whatever, but Italians have more fun. Right. That's why French people always go to Italy for vacation. I'm sure you've noticed. But obviously I'm biased. But it's you know, obviously there's a lot of things to discover there. But you know, these particular wines are really interesting. You know, you have a really beautiful bittersweet chocolate or something, and you'd be very happy with Ripasso. I don't smoke with cigars or anything, but that would be another, I think, very fabulous way to wind down an evening would be to have a cigar and a glass of Ripasso, especially one like that.
Well, this was beautiful. Well, thank you very much, Antonio. It was great to have you here. Thank you for opening up the celebration of Italian wines like only you could. Again, we got the Viva Italia auction coming up Wednesday and Thursday. Thursday night's the big Italian section. We got 400 lots, including 5 domain direct consignments, some very special things. We worked hard on it. We're very proud about it to offer some of the world's great Italian wines. And thank you for all the guidance that you've given to us and the consumers in Italian wine. Keep up the great work, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, John. Nice evening. Thanks. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.